Greetings and welcome back to our study in Mark's Gospel. Today we are in Mark 15 and we're going to start around verse 20 and go through the end of the chapter, at least hopefully. The chapter begins with Jesus being taken to the cross, and we see right away that Jesus is in no shape to carry the cross beam. Now, he would have been carrying one large beam. This was the cross beam. There would have been a post stuck in the ground. Jesus would have carried the beam to that, the cross beam to it. At the site of the cross, he would have been tied to that beam. We are told that he was nailed. That was a torture device. The nails were not to hold the weight of the victim. The ropes that would have tied him held his weight. The nails were there for added punishment, added pain. Um, the idea that he can't move his hands without or his legs without some sort of uh, pain from the metal tearing against his flesh. But it was the ropes that would have held him. Jesus is carrying this crossbeam. He is unable to do that. So the guards that are accompanying him, not wanting to carry the beam themselves, conscript somebody standing in the crowd, and that person standing in the crowd is Simon of Cyrene. Now, Mark identifies him by Alexander and Rufus, his children. This, this detail implies that Alexander and Rufus are known to the community that Mark is writing to. These are people that Mark's first readers could have gone and talked to. And the fact that Mark identifies them by first names only, and it's just kind of an out of the way thing, says, hey, look, these are people you know. This is their dad. This is how we know this story. It's a clue to the eyewitness account. Mark himself does not seem to have seen this account. He is relying on other witnesses, and this is one of them, the memory of Simon of Cyrene. Now, just because it does come up, I'm going to, just a second, John talks about Jesus carrying his own cross. Now, John is probably emphasizing this because by the time he is writing some 20 to 30 years after Mark, there was a theory circulated among unbelievers that Jesus was never crucified. He was beaten and tortured, but then the soldiers made Simon of Cyrene carry his cross and accidentally nailed Simon of Cyrene to the cross. So John highlights that Jesus carried his own cross. The reality is Jesus probably started out carrying his cross, got part of the way to Golgotha, and then was unable to carry the cross. Just as church tradition has kind of taught, this is probably likely since we have these two competing traditions. It does seem that they're emphasizing either end of the journey more than the totality of the journey. But we do have an idea of who the man was who carried Jesus' cross. Whether or not he ever became a follower, we are not told. The implication is that two of his sons did become followers, but we are not told about Simon himself. Tradition tells us that he did later become a follower, but we're, again, not explicitly told here. Jesus goes to the cross, and he's hung on the cross sometime, we're told, in the late morning, where he goes to the Golgotha, the place of the skull. We're not 100% sure where this location is, although there is a tradition that identifies it as a knoll outside of Jerusalem. But we don't have 100% knowledge on that. Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh. We're not told who offers it to him, but he is offered it. The idea is that the myrrh is supposed to disorient him and to dull the pain, dull his senses. Whether this is the Roman soldiers who are offering him the myrrh, hoping that it will take longer for him to die and kind of prolong the agony, or whether it is some kind-hearted people along the way who are offering this to him in order to, so that he does not feel what's going coming in his near future. We're not told. What we are told is Jesus refuses it, it seems as though he is trying to keep his word to his disciples that the next time he tastes wine will be with them in the kingdom. Um, but it also might be that he wants to have a clear mind while he's up on the cross. He might be glad for the clear mind to be able to communicate with people. Um, that's uh, that is not known why he refused, just that he refused. He does, however, at the end take on, it says in some translations sour wine. I think vinegar is probably a closer translation, something to ease his thirst, but it's hard to say. It does seem to be some sort of vinegar, something that in some way would have eased his thirst, but I honestly do not know what that would have been or how that would have eased his thirst, because it does not sound very appetizing. Um, Jesus is hung on the cross. We are told that he is nailed. Again, that's a torture element that is not supportive. The soldiers below Jesus gamble for his clothes. This is a reference to Psalm 22. Uh, there are many references to Psalm 22. In fact, from the time that Simon picks up his cross, I said in the last video that the beatings remind us of the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. Well, this crucifixion scene in Mark is built around Psalm 22. There are many references back to Psalm 22, where if you know that psalm, you know it begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then it goes into all of the suffering that this individual has endured on God's behalf. The idea that this person is broken and beaten by the enemy and is not in a position of they're in a position where they are crumbling, and yet God, at the end, God delivers them and they are victorious and they are celebratory. So we see behind Mark's account, we see Psalm 22 kind of in the background, and you are supposed to read this section of Mark 15 thinking about Psalm 22 and thinking about how um, even when God seems distant and it seems like the enemy is victorious, there is still coming that time of reversal where God is going to step in and win the day. And that's exactly what happens to Jesus. So do think, when you're reading about this passage, when you're reading through this passage, do go back and read Psalm 22 and think about it in light of Jesus's crucifixion. Um, Again, not to say that the soldiers didn't really gamble for Jesus's clothes, not to say that this isn't a historical event, but Mark doesn't have to include it. We always ask on these little details like this, why is Mark including this detail? And the reason is because it points us back to Psalm 22. He wants us to see that. He wants us to filter this whole passage through that. Speaking of that, Jesus does cry out, and Mark gives us the words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is argued back and forth among scholars whether Jesus actually felt forsaken on the cross or whether he was just quoting Psalm 22:1 and praying the psalm on the cross. I don't know for certain. I tend to lean towards Jesus was praying the psalm on the cross, but that's not, I'm not very certain about that. Because it very well could be that Jesus felt forsaken by God on the cross. It very well could be that Jesus felt like he was enduring more pain than he could possibly deal with, and that God was distant and not answering him. That is possible. And it would fit it does fit into a very nice, neat theology, and many have articulated that. But I tend to think that Jesus is demonstrating his prayer on the cross, and that's what he is intended. We should note, before we get back to kind of keep some semblance of the timeline, We should note that Jesus is crucified with one criminal on his right and one on his left. And the word that is used is this word for insurrectionist that Jesus has said earlier in the garden. Am I this insurrectionist that you have come at me with swords and clubs? He is crucified. He's identified with the insurrectionists. Luke will make this explicit. In Luke's gospel, Jesus says to the disciples, it's time to take up swords so that we can look like insurrectionists. And the disciples say, here's two. And Jesus responds to him, enough of that. That's enough. Don't do that. He's being clever. And they take him literally, something we tend to do very often. Jesus is being clever and we take him too literally. But this here, where he has a criminal on his right, an insurrectionist on his right and on his left, this reminds us of James and John, who want to be on Jesus' right and left when he comes into glory. And here, who is on his right and left but insurrectionists, the lowest of the low? Jesus walks into glory with them, not with his greatest disciples. That is a lesson that we need to meditate on, of who is surrounding Jesus, when and why. And what is Jesus comfortable with? He is comfortable, well, at least to some degree. He is comfortable with being in the company of these individuals who really represent the wrong way of doing things. And he is willing to die with them, even though he's not one of them. It's just a really great reminder for us. It's also a reminder for me that this whole thing is about Jesus being insulted. First, the beating and the torture in the guardhouse, the mocking that he would have endured there, the carrying the cross, the fact that he is stripped naked, completely naked on the cross. We tend to give Jesus clothes on the cross, or at least something to cover himself up, but he would not have been. He would have been completely exposed on the cross, completely in sheer agony with the pain. And everybody who's walking by in Mark's gospel insults him. Mark does not have that the thief or the criminal on the cross saying to Jesus anything positive. In Luke's gospel, this criminal opens up to Jesus and says, hey, you don't deserve to die, we do. And he repents. Mark's gospel doesn't mention that. He wants us to see Jesus as completely insulted, completely distant from everybody, ridiculed and abused in every conceivable way. Even when the centurion says to Jesus, or says of Jesus, not to Jesus, says of Jesus, surely this man was the Son of God. That is not necessarily a genuine statement. It is very possible that that guard, seeing Jesus die, kind of in disgrace, is making a joke at Jesus's expense. It is entirely possible that the centurion sees Jesus and says, this guy's not a son of God. I don't know why anybody would believe that. It's very possible. And what Mark is capitalizing on is the irony in the statement, and not this genuine, it's not necessarily a genuine conviction of the centurion. It's an ironic statement. But again, it could be genuine. I tend to think that everybody in Mark's at the crucifixion is kind of insulting Jesus, with the exception of the women, and that's part of Mark's intent. He wants you to see that everybody is insulting Jesus, everybody is abusing him, everybody is laying it on him except these women. And that could, and I could be wrong about that, but that's how I tend to see it. Even the chief priests and the legal experts, the people who had him crucified, stopped by just to heckle Jesus, just to insult him one last time, even after they have won the battle. And they have had him crucified. So there's a couple of things that, a couple last things on Jesus' death. Number one is the idea of the sun being darkened. We don't know whether or not that was a literal statement. Some people have talked about an eclipse. Mark says it lasted 3 hours. No eclipse is going to last 3 hours. Plus, if you know anything about astronomy, and then this is not going to shock you at all, Passover comes at the full moon. And so since there was a full moon, there could not be a total eclipse. You can't, a full moon is visible on the opposite side of the earth than what a total eclipse would be. So you can't have a full moon and a total eclipse in the same day. So since we know this is Passover, there could not have been a total eclipse. Was there darkness? Was there some sort of cloud cover, extra thick cloud cover? It's possible. But Mark is clearly meaning this to allude to passages of God's judgment where it says on the day of God's judgment that there will be darkness. The moon will turn red. All these kinds of lines that you are so used to from the Old Testament or from Revelation. Mark is clearly playing on that. Mark is saying to us, this is God's judgment against Israel. This is God's judgment of Jesus being innocent, and the temple curtain being torn is, while so many people will talk about how that exposes the holy place to human eyes, and that this is God opening the door to everyone, and there's some good theology there, so I don't want to completely discount it. It's also a reality that the temple curtain being torn would have been seen by Jews as a sign that God was not present in the temple. The fact that the holiest place could be exposed meant that God's presence had been removed from the temple. So all of those passages that are so confusing to people about that Jesus talks about, where he's quoting Daniel 7 about the Son of Man, where he's quoting the prophets like Joel talking about God's day of wrath, the parts that have been somewhat confusing surrounding judgment, all of this is coming to a head right here. Jesus has said to the chief priests, you will see me in glory. Well, the only way that they can see Jesus in glory is if the temple is not useful, if the temple is not God's home. So this curtain being torn is a sign to them that God's presence is no longer in the temple, that Jesus has taken authority, just like he had said the night before. It's not just about people having access to God. It's about God's presence no longer being where the Jewish community at that time had always seen God's presence. God is no longer dwelling in the temple, and that's kind of what that's all about. Now, we've already alluded to Jesus's words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that are, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, people confuse that and say, why is he calling for Elijah, or let's see if Elijah's coming, and these kinds of things. The reason is it would have been very similar. Jesus would the difference between what Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and Elijah is Elijah, Elijah, lama sabachthani. And you can understand that Jesus, parched and thirsty on the cross, tortured, unable to speak clearly, would have mumbled that in a way that some people would not have understood the difference between Eloi, my God, and Elijah, Elijah. So you can see why they would be thinking Jesus was calling for Elijah to come save him. And especially since Elijah was supposed to come before the Messiah, and Jesus is being hailed as the King of the Jews. This is why Mark tells us explicitly that the King of the Jews was what was tacked on above him. That's why. How can Elijah, the prophet who is supposed to come before the Messiah, allow the Messiah to die? That's what they're saying. Jesus is seeing that, or Jesus is calling out for God, again, quoting Psalm 22:1, and people are misrepresenting it, misinterpreting it as Jesus calling for Elijah's help. So Jesus dies. He gives he dies around 3 o'clock, or at 3 o'clock. We've talked about the temple being torn and the um, the centurion. We now have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, um, and then two other, or at least one other woman in Salome, who are witnesses, and they see this. There's some debate about who Mary the mother of James is. Uh, it does seem very possible that Mary, the mother of James, could also be Mary, the mother of Joseph, in the next chapter, and that this is Mary, Jesus' mother. But it might also be a different Mary. There are several Marys in the New Testament, and we are not sure which one is which. We do know from John's Gospel that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was at the crucifixion. However, we are not sure that she is with this particular group. It could be that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome are different women. They're part of Jesus' disciple group, but they're not part of, but that's not Mary the mother of Jesus. It is they are meant to show, or they're meant to represent that they are meant to represent that all the men have fled, but that the women, the female disciples whose Jesus has included, but nobody else would include, Jesus included them, they have remained faithful. They are still there watching and standing next to Jesus. It is meant to elevate their status in Jesus' disciple group. Where everybody else has fled away, they have not. This is one of those small, subtle ways where the Bible cuts against kosher. Because in Jesus' world, these women would not have had the dignity or the authority to be disciples. They would not have been elevated to this level. The New Testament is subtly saying, hey, in our system, these women are equal to Jesus' other disciples. In fact, they're more diligent. In this instance, they were better. It's a way of subtly cutting against Roman and Jewish expectations at the time. Now, Joseph of Arimathea is Joseph of Arimathea, we're told, is one of the Sanhedrin. He goes to Pilate and requests Jesus' body for burial. Now, typically, crucifixion victims were not buried. They were left on the crosses until their bodies just decayed to the point that they fell from the cross, and they were just left there, and animals would eat them. The soldiers at the foot of the cross were there to make sure that nobody interfered with the crucifixion and that nobody stole the bodies. But that does not mean that it is entirely impossible for Joseph to have done this. We have already seen where Pilate is ready to make, he's willing to play political games. It is entirely possible. In fact, I'd say it's somewhat likely that Joseph, if he was a high-ranking member of the council, did make a request of Pilate and was able to talk him into letting him have Jesus' body, especially if the other Gospels are to be believed, that Pilate had ordered the legs broken of the other criminals so that they would die quickly. They would have died within a few minutes of their legs being broken, because they would not have been able to gain, they would not have been able to take breath. So it is entirely possible that what was going on here is that because it was Passover, the Jews were requesting from Pilate that the bodies of these victims not be on display during Passover, and that these individuals who have been crucified break their legs so that we don't have this kind of filth lying around during our sacred time. And if I was one of the Sanhedrin, I would have looked at Pilate and said, this will be an offense to the people who are pilgrims here, and it will make them angry. It will cause you to have more work, not to take them down. So it is likely that Pilate is thinking very pragmatically. He's told the soldiers to have the prisoners killed, or the victims killed. And when they do this, they see Jesus is dead. The soldiers are instructed to take the bodies down so that they would not be grotesque during this holy feast. And they are to discard the bodies, probably in some sort of mass grave or in a ravine somewhere nearby, somewhere where they're not going to be seen. They're going to be out of the way. And Joseph of Arimathea says, well, if you're just going to throw this body away, can I have my people take it and bury it? And that's probably what happened. And Pilate just says, whatever. Again, he's probably not terribly concerned with Jesus in any reasonable way. He does not think Jesus is a real threat to his power. He does not think Jesus, even if Jesus is claiming to be a king, he's not seeing Jesus as somebody who is leading this potential revolt. He sees Jesus as something else, something that is not a threat to him at all. So he's kind of happy to get rid of all of this. At least in my opinion, he's just saying to Joseph, yeah, whatever. I'm just going to have my guards discard the bodies anyway. And maybe Joseph came to Pilate and said, hey, since these guys are dead, can I just remove all of the bodies so that we don't have any problems? And what Joseph is doing is not just burying Jesus, but burying all of the victims of the crucifixion that day. Maybe he's made a deal with Pilate to take away all of the bodies so that Passover can go off in a little better way. In any case, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Joseph, and maybe potentially others see where Jesus is buried. Now again, who is this Mary? This Mary that's identified, possibly the same Mary is identified as the mother of James, but we're not sure. Anyway, they see on Friday, definitely before sundown, around 6 o'clock, they see where Jesus is buried. Their plan is, because they are not allowed to do this after sunset on that Friday, their plan is to come back early Sunday morning to honor the body and embalm him a little bit, or at least anoint him in some ways. Again, remember the feast starts at sundown and it goes until sundown the next day, the Saturday. So they're not going to go out Saturday evening either. They're going to wait until Sunday at daylight so they have more time to work and more daylight to work. Anyway, that is where we are leaving at this time. As always, if you have questions or comments, please let me know. I would love to talk to you about this. And until we meet again, God